let's get over to the desk. Let's get into this. I'm putting the coffee down on the table. If you're listening to this on the podcast, you won't have seen that action, but I can tell you this much. The fact that the coffee's on the desk means we're now ready to have a long conversation. Hey everybody, I'm Tennessee Fats. Welcome to the channel and welcome to my desk. And I think the most exciting part of this for me is saying the next line, which is welcome to the first episode. Now, I've already shot an intro that's going at the beginning of this playlist explaining what we're doing here. But this is the actual first episode of the Tennessee Fats Library where we're going to walk through a story. And it's a podcast. That's the point of this, all right? I know I'm sitting here and I'm recording this and I'm looking at a camera as I'm going through this. The microphone's right there. But the point of this is, and as I mentioned in the intro, it's to get, consumers of this content to walk away from the video format and really get more into just listening to what we're doing here. Sitting and listening to me talk on a screen has got to be phenomenally dull. So this is an opportunity for you to take these podcasts, because these each will be translated into a podcast, and then take it with you. If you're going to the gym and you're on a treadmill and you're bored and you need something to listen to, well, maybe this will fill that space for you. That's the example I would give you, and that's what we're doing here. So this is the first one. And as a result of this being the first one, and since we have no idea how this is going to go, because I'm literally recording this in one take, this is just one walkthrough. So you got to bear in mind, there's going to be some foibles here as we go. We'll call them growing pains. I decided to go with a short story. I decided to cheat a little bit. I went back to my comfort zone. And my comfort zone really is in the Robert E. Howard stuff and some of the more Eldritch level stuff. And I decided to go with a story here that's a short story that really I have a lot of fun reading. And the story that we're going to cover today is Robert E. Howard's Sea Curse. Now, it's not the Sea Curse. It's just called Sea Curse, which is weird because it doesn't roll off your tongue the right way because it's missing the in front. But maybe that's my sentiment today, and 100 years ago it would have been perfectly fine. So what do I know? So we're going to go through this one and we'll see how it goes, all right? Before I go diving into longer stories, I want to make sure that we've got this thing all set up and it's going correctly. Now, we've got the camera sitting over there. I've got my written notes in front of me that I'm going to scroll through on the screen. If you're watching the video, you're going to see me reach over here because I'm going to move a mouse up and down every once in a while because I've got to scroll down through the actual text that I've got here. And, well, let's get through this. Before I go into it, though, let's get into some admin. What's the structure of this podcast, or this video? We'll call it a podcast. What's the structure of this podcast going to be? Well, the first thing is we're going to walk through the story. I'm going to give you the protagonist, antagonist, characters' names, the settings, and at the same time walk through what actually happens in it. What are the actual actions in the story? This is not a spoiler-free thing. We're going to walk through the whole thing. And in that is where we're actually going to do some reading. Because why would I give you everything? Listen, me talking is not going to give you all of the context and really the tone that Howard was going for. I know what the tone is when I talk. And it's not what Howard wrote, especially when he's doing a horror story. There's no way in heck I should ever narrate a horror story, because I can tell you, that ain't my tone. It ain't going to work. So we're going to go through that. When we're done walking through the story with the readings, we're then going to go through, well, what are some of the themes that are in here? And really what's interesting about this one, and the reason why I specifically chose this story, is I remembered the themes in here really are timeless ones. And it really is interesting that you're looking at a tale that's written so long ago, but how it actually applies to us today so much. And it's applied to really us between then and now without ever leaving the importance of these themes. And then we'll walk through, well, what are some of the things that jumped out at me that made me go, wow, that's really neat. Then I'm going to do something different. This was originally published in May of 1928. So as the recording of this podcast, that means that this is 97 years old. The language we used 97 years ago is not the same language we use today. Let's face facts. There are terms in there that Howard uses that are very important to him. And they're very important to setting not only context, i.e. tone, but also particular context to the characters of understanding, well, who is that person? How old are they? And what actually happened? There's a big one of the what actually happened here. And we'll go through that then. Lastly, we'll leave this, podcast off with, what are the next steps? What should you read after this if you're interested in more content like this? And really, what could I point you to that will help you and give you something else to enjoy that's in addition to just what we talked about today? So that's it. Now hold on for a second. I got to move the squeakiest chair on the planet here. And it's going to be interesting because as a podcast, I wonder how much the actual squeaking the mic picks up as we go through this. This should be interesting. Let's find out as we go. All right, so first time scrolling down here, let's get into the story. The story is actually a very quick one. It's only a couple pages, but there's a lot of layers in this. So let's walk through, broad brushstrokes here, Tennessee Fats. What happens? Okay, it's a story about a bully and one of his cronies, and how at one point in time in the story, they clearly cross a line. And it's not even a case of, did they just slightly cross the line? Oh, no. These guys didn't just cross the line. They saw the line, pissed on it, set fire to it, and then just kept walking. This was bad. And as a result of their, stupid actions, they die. And deservedly so, but in horrible, horrible ways. It's a thing. It's a thing where you really get levels of horror layered onto that brief synopsis I've just given you. And that's why we're going to go through it in details. Okay? So the story takes place and starts out in a small seaside town called Faring Town. Not Faring, Faring Town. And it's narrated by a young man. Now, and this is a nameless young man. Throughout the entire story, you do not get a sense of who this person is. But by listening really carefully to some of the language used in here, and we'll talk about this more when we get into the archaic language that I had to look up, you get a clear sense that this is a young man. Now, I, as an educated guess, have assumed that this individual is between the age of 10 and 13. And I'll explain more about why I specifically said that range when we get to the archaic language section. But for now, let's just take that, pin it to the wall, and walk with that idea. All right? So, this narrator in this one, this nameless narrator, starts off right off the bat by painting a picture of the bullies. But it's not just painting a picture of the bullies. It's a one-paragraph section that paints the pictures of the bullies, but also juxtaposes them against the people in the city, the people of Faring Town. And it's done in such a wonderful way because Howard is jumping into this right off the bat, hitting you over the head with the hammer, saying, here's the stone, not the stone, the tone, start paying attention. Now, everybody in this seaside town basically makes their living from the sea, but these two are different. Now, let's jump into the first paragraph. I'm not going to bother trying to summarize this any further. Let's just jump into the first paragraph here and go into how different these guys are, and also what's going on in town. Wonderfully written here, so let's jump into it here. They were the brawlers and the braggarts, the loud boasters and hard drinkers of Faring Town. It's Faring Town, not Faring. John Cullrich, okay, and his crony Lylip Canool. Many a time have I, a tousled-haired lad, now that's an archaic term we're going to be diving into later, stolen into the tavern doors to listen to their curses, their profane arguments, and their wild sea songs. Half fearful and half in admiration of these wild rovers, I, all of the people of Faring Town, gazed on them with fear and admiration, for they were not like the rest of Faring men. That's interesting because in that sentence he used Faring Town and then Faring on its own. They were not content to ply their trade off the coast and among the shark-teeth shoals. Now that's important because it actually helps set the tone specifically of where this is. A little bit. It helps you guess it. No yawls, no skiffs for them. They fared far, farther than any other man in the village, for they shipped on the great sailing ships that went out in the white tides to brave the restless gray ocean and make ports in strange lands. So really what you get here is you get a sense of these guys being the rovers. They're the guys with wanderlust. They're the ones who are out there leaving town. They've had enough of Faring Town. They've had enough of Faring Town people. They're choosing to leave. Very different than the other people of Faring Town who are plying their trade specifically along the shore. They're not going out into the great gray ocean. They're staying in the white waters up close to the shore. Really a different thing. And it does set the tone of both the people as well as what we're going to call the antagonists. These are not the protagonists. These are the antagonists in the story. Really does set that. And Howard, once again, bonk with a hammer over the head. Here's what's going on. Done. In one paragraph. The guy was a genius. Anyways, so that is the tone. Let's talk about what the action goes, though. And I've got to take a pencil and put it in the book before I lose this. So the action of the events start with John and Lylip coming home from their last long voyage. And they've come into town in what you are to assume is their normal boisterous way, where they're being loud, they're slapping people, they're insulting people, they're singing songs, And they come into town, they hit the shore, and everybody runs down to the shore to see them because, well, this is the only new news you have in town. So everybody goes to check it out. But at the same time, there's that mixture of both fear and admiration. In that first paragraph, Howard referenced fear and admiration twice. There's a reason why those two things are there. They're either ends of the spectrum, and both of these apply. And these clowns have come off the ship now, are acting this way. And the people of the town, the townsfolk, are acting in one of two ways. They're either backing off, and you do get a sense that the backing off is very much focused in women, or they are becoming a hanger-on. They are wandering off to the bar to listen to their tall tales. Now, I use the term tall tales here, but Howard doesn't actually say anywhere in the story, these guys are liars. Braggart could kind of infer it, but I don't know. Maybe I'm filling in a gap there that doesn't exist. Anyways, but one thing that is kind of neat is at this point in time, Howard also makes it very clear, coming through the visage or the view of this young man, that the tavern loafers are really the weaker members of Faringtown. And it's interesting because he says it was the tavern loafers that viewed these fools as, and I'm quoting this now because this is a direct line, valiant knights and nature's noblemen who dared to be men of blood and brawn. Okay, all right, so you get a sense that maybe there's something here to be admired, but maybe that doesn't give them the right to behave the way they are. There's clearly a difference between the people of the village, and it's noted for you right there at the beginning, and it comes back again. And this is a wonderful line that comes in later on where they come into town, and there's more narrative now coming up because now Howard wants to give you a clear sense of, okay, once again, these guys are different. Now let's get into the meat and potatoes. And the line he uses, and all feared them. So that when a man was beaten or a woman insulted, the villagers muttered and did nothing. Now, okay, you got a sense when they came off the boat that it was somewhat heavily laden towards the women folk who were backing away. But let's talk about this women insulted point. So a man would be beaten and the villagers would do nothing. A woman would be insulted and they would... Now, maybe this is a hearkening back to a chivalrous age. Maybe this is hearkening back to, oh, well, you said something negative to that lady. I'm going to slap you with a glove and, we're going to have some sort of conversation. I don't think that's what Howard was going for here. I'm thinking insulted possibly inferred something a little more sinister. And again, through that confusing language, it again sets the tone of how these guys are different. But now we have to start getting into the story. So here's these guys being different. What's juxtaposed against them? And this is where we start to see, well, what's the action? And immediately, who are the people involved? Okay, so we just finished that line, which was, and all feared them. Okay, you got through that. Same paragraph now. Howard is not wasting time. And so when Moll Farrell's niece, now that's important, Moll Farrell is now introduced, was put to shame by John Culrick, none dared even put in words what all thought. Okay. Now, there's a term in there, put to shame. But there's also, again, this tone that these two are kind of, well, are they above the law? We don't really know, okay? But you start to get a sense of that. Now, with that, now, somebody's been put to shame, okay? Nobody's saying anything, but you get a sense that the town might be in a position where it should say something. All right, because remember, it said, put in words what all thought. Now, Moll was introduced in that chapter. Moll is actually the protagonist in the story. And Moll is a very different character as far as her role in the village, as well as her role in the story. She's not this over-the-top boisterous person. And Howard really, again, in the same paragraph, you've just finished that sentence about, what all thought, immediately jumps into, and this is Moll. Okay, so here, I'm going to read for you here. I want you to get a sense of Moll, because she is different. Okay, Moll had never married, and she and the girl lived alone in a little hut down close to the beach. Now, a little hut would suggest that maybe they're not well-to-do. And the next sentence really makes it clear. So close to this high tide that the waves came almost to the door. Well, that's not a good thing when you're living in a fishing village. The people of the village accounted old Moll something of a witch. Okay, well, now we're starting to hear some language that's really pointing a different picture. Bear in mind, she and the girl live alone down by the beach, but they see her as a witch. and she was a grim, gaunt old dame who had little to say to anyone. But she minded her own business and eked out a slim living, so clearly not well-to-do, by gathering clams and picking up bits of driftwood. I imagine the driftwood would keep you warm at night. I don't know that that's really something that would make money. Do you sell driftwood? I don't know. That's something I didn't look up. I should probably look that up. Anyway, you get a sense that she's not well-to-do. You get a sense that she's probably one of the poorer people in village, number one. And number two, that she really lives on her own. But again, there's the language here of a gaunt old dame. Interesting, very interesting. So you get a sense that this is very different than this over-the-top, boisterous John and Lila. Totally different. But this is where now the story suddenly takes action. And I'm going to read a large component to you here. Bear in mind, we've just been told that Moll's niece was, the phrase they used, put to shame by John. Here's where things suddenly ramp up. Okay? I mind the day was a cold winter day with a sharp breeze out of the east when the old dame came into the village street. Village street, not streets. Street, one, singular. Small town. Shrieking that girl had vanished. All scattered all over the beach and back among the bleak inland hills in search for her. And again, inland hills. You're getting more of a sense of the geography of the space. All save John Culrick. Wonder why that is. And his cronies who sat at the tavern dicing and topping. I think I know what topping is. That's actually it's another archaic term. That'd be interesting to look up. Well, I'll save that for another day. All the while, beyond the shoals, we heard the never-ceasing droning of the heaving, restless, gray monster. Once again, the ocean being this gray, monstrous creature. You already had the reference at the beginning in that first paragraph, and now we hear you say it again. And in the dim light of the ghostly dawn, Moll Farrell's girl came home. So they literally looked all day and all night. The tides bore her gently across the wet sands and laid her amongst her own, almost at her own door. Virgin white she was, and her arms were folded across her still bosom. Calm was her face, and the grey tides sighed about her slender limbs. Moll Farrell's eyes were stone, yet she stood above her dead girl and spoke no word until John Culrick and his crony came reeling down from the tavern, their drinking jacks still in their hand. That's their mugs. Drunk as was John Culrick. I keep getting that one wrong. And the people gave back before him. Bear in mind, they're all terrified of this guy, but they also know that he, what was the phrase? Put to shame this young lady. Murder was in their souls. So this is another point where the villagers clearly are putting two and two together here. What the two and two are, though, is something we have to talk about later. Alright, so he came and laughed at Moll Farrell across the body of the girl. Zounds, swore John Culrick. The wench has drowned herself, Lylip. Lylip laughed and with a twist of his thin mouth. He had always hated Moll Farrell, for it was she that had given him the name of Lylip. That actually is quite funny. I should start giving people names like that. Then John Culrick lifted his drinking jack, swaying on his uncertain legs. A health to the wench's ghost, he bellowed, and all stood aghast. Wow. What a dick move. Like that. Okay, you had a sense that there was something the matter with this guy up front. You really did. Like, the people did not like him. And you're like, okay, all right. But really? You had to do that. Like, remember I said earlier, these guys crossed a line, and it wasn't a case where they just slightly crossed a line. They clearly crossed a line. Yeah, that was clearly crossing the line. Now, when we go through this, you're left asking a couple questions. What specifically were the actions that led to this young lady's death? That was something that stuck out to me. It made me go, well, what actually did lead to this? Did he actually murder her? Did he know this? And there's a lot of questions in there. And you know what? I'm going to give an idea about that later when I get into the language that's used here, because again, this is somewhat archaic language. But I am going to give you my idea here just to make sure the story moves forward. Okay, and again, my impressions just from reading this, again, back and forth about 3 to 4 times and doing some Googling to try to get this down pat. Here's my idea. Moll's niece did, in fact, sleep with John. I believe that is the put to shame. Well, actually, that's not the put to shame. The put to shame is the fact that she likely did this willingly because John was likely being all boisterous and impressive and was probably lying through his teeth. But I think probably after he got what he wanted, he promptly rebuffed her. Perhaps that is the put to shame. Again, I'm reading between the lines, I'm guesstimating here, but that's kind of what I'm assuming has happened here. And as a result of this, she now feels shame for what has occurred, which very much a 100-year-old idea. Again, I'm not saying that there's a lot of things that could be inferred from this. I am actually saddened by the fact that what I think happened here happened, which is the fact that she actually did drown herself out of a sense of shame for what had occurred, which is horrible. It's absolutely horrible. I do legitimately believe that John was surprised when he did arrive and she was drowned. However, the fact that he and his cronies did not leave the tavern when they found out she was missing kind of makes me suggest that maybe he was suspicious that she might have done this. And that's just, again, a dick move. All right. So anyway, that's my read into this one. All right. So that's kind of where we're going with this. Now, let's get back to the story once we've got that out of the way, because that's how I'm reading this. And this is where I think some of the anger really starts jumping through for good reason. Obviously, this doesn't sit well with Moll. And she comes up with one hell of a curse. Now, bear in mind, the people view her as a witch. That does not mean that she is a witch up until this point in time. Yeah, it becomes fairly clear that she's a witch here. Now, I am not even going to try to turn around and try to give you the tone of what this thing is. Just picture this thing screaming and yelling, and it's not good, okay? A curse of the foul fiend upon you, John Cullrich, she screamed. A curse of God may rest upon your vile soul throughout eternity. May you gaze on sights that shall sear the eyes of you and scorch the soul of you. May you die a bloody death and writhe in hell's flames for 1,000,000 and 1,000,000 and yet 1,000,000 years. Ooh, it goes on. Yeah. I curse you by land and by sea, by earth and by air, by the demons of the ocean and the demons of the swampland, the fiends of the forest and the goblins of the hills. And you, her lean finger stabbed to Lylip Cunol as he started backward, his face paling. You shall be the death of John Cullrich, and he shall be the death of you. You shall bring John Cullrich to the doors of hell, and John Cullrich shall bring you to the gallows tree. I set the seal of death upon your brow, John Cullrich. You shall live in terror and die in horror, far out upon the grey, cold sea. But the sea that took the soul of innocence to her bosom shall not take you, but shall fling forth your vile carcass to the sands. I, John Cullrich. And she spoke with such a terrible intensity that the drunken mockery on the man's face changed to one of swinish stupidity. Poor pigs. The sea roars for the victim it will not keep. There is snow upon the hills, John Cullrich, and ere it melts your corpse will lie at my feet, and I shall spit upon it and be content. Oh, that is harsh. That nicely done. I tell you, Howard, you would write one hell of a curse. Again, well done. But it really does give you a sense. Okay, maybe Moll's not exactly what we think she is. The village people thought she was a witch, but that kind of clearly states, yeah, I'm a witch, and you know what? You're effed. That's harsh. Okay. Anyways, let's get back to the story here. Okay, so the day after the niece's body is found, John and Lylip ship out, and they're not seen for the rest of the summer. And during this time, Moll is withering away, but keeping to herself. And the village folk are trying to interact with her and trying to comfort her, but she's really not having anything to do with them. And she is apparently getting weaker and weaker as the days go on. But at dusk and dawn each day, she does go to the beach. She looks up at the hills to see if the snow is still there. And then she looks into the ocean to see if it's boring a body to her. Basically, she's saying, well, what's happening here? I've thrown out my curse. When is this coming full circle? And at the end of the summer, a ship does come in, and everybody runs down to the shore because, well, this is the news. It's the big thing in town. And Lylip is the only one that comes on shore. And this is interesting because he turns around, and this goes to his name. It's saying that John left the ship in Sumatra. Now, Sumatra would sound phenomenally exotic to the readers of 1928. And I'm sure to North Americans today, it would probably still sound phenomenally exotic. But the fact that we can Google it and see pictures of it and videos of it kind of really drills that down. But it adds a level of, really? Wow, Sumatra? That's awesome. It makes the lie just over the top, which is kind of interesting. It makes you kind of wonder, well, is Howard making it perfectly clear? But then again, these guys do sail to far foreign lands, and that's what makes them so different. So it's almost like Lylip is playing upon the naivety of the people of town in that lie. It's almost like he's playing upon that by saying, well, no, he's just there, and everybody will buy that because, well, nobody else goes to Sumatra. Anyways, Maul does come wandering down to the shore, because obviously a boat has come in, and sees Lylip, where Lylip is sort of sitting there going, well, what's she going to do here? And she starts yelling at him, and gives him a very Shakespearean moment. Not in what she says, but in his reaction, where he yells that there's blood on his hands. And Lylip does almost like an out damn spot kind of moment, and jumps back, and starts to almost unconsciously trying to clean his hands. But then catches himself, and then it's like, oh, no, I'm not cleaning my hands. And he basically composes himself, calls her a witch, and then wanders off. And people follow him off to the tavern the same way they did with John back in the day. But the language is changing slightly now. You get more of a sense that people are following him in sort of a only half invested manner. Let's put it that way. Anyways, the whole next day, nothing really happens. But the fog has come in. It's a heavy fog. And we now cut scene back to our nameless narrator, where he and his friend Joe, we do have a name for the friend, not necessarily for the narrator at this point in time, are sitting in a small rowboat that's tied to the dock in this fog-infested area. Now, you can't see anything in the bay. There's nothing to see. And the two of them are kind of daring one another in their language. They're like, oh, I hope there was some reason for us to row off because, well, they're kids. This is the sort of thing that they're thinking. And they're looking for some sort of adventure. Until the friend, Joe, suddenly claims he's hearing oarlocks and oars and that they should row out to meet him. Well, it doesn't take much to convince our, again, young narrator to say, yeah, let's do this. And they untie the rope and off they go. And they immediately find themselves lost in the fog. And while they're lost in the fog, they're rowing. And they are out there rowing for the entirety of the night. An entire night goes by where they're rowing, where Joe is constantly claiming he's hearing the oars, claiming he's hearing the oarlocks. They're rowing in the direction that Joe is pointing to, but they never find anything. And this is what's interesting, because this is where the first piece of the Eldritch level horror that goes with the curse suddenly appears. You've had fog for 24 hours, and suddenly, clarity. The fog dissipates. There's nothing. Nameless narrator and Joe now find themselves sitting at a becalmed ocean out past the bay. All right, so you're outside the shelter of the bay, but the ocean is dead calm. Dead calm. That's pretty creepy. That's really creepy, actually. But they compose themselves, and they're like, okay, well, it's time to row back in. Look, there's the shore. Let's get on in there. And as they start to row, they hear a sound which suddenly causes a problem. There is a massive galley bearing down on them, and it's not small. And at this point in time, right off the bat, all they see is the prow of the boat. And they're thinking, we got to get out of the way. They row as much as they can to get out of the way, and then recognize, oh, poop, that is a galley with oars sticking out of the side. We really need to get out of the way. And they go wide to get out of the way on this thing. And they turn around and they get to the back of the galley. And as they're getting there, they're both talking to one another, and they're wondering, wait a minute, this is a galley. And how did this get here? Like, this is the ocean, the open ocean. Why would a galley be? And they said, well, this is a galley like those of Barbary. And that's a particular term that we'll come back to later. So they do decide to row after the galley and catch up with it, because the oars are rowing away, and obviously it's a big boat. Let's go find out what this is. They find a chain at the back, and they pull themselves up on it. And now this is where we get to where Howard decides, let's just throw some more horror into this, shall we? So let's get to this part here that we're going to read next, okay? Here we go. Joe gets on the ship first, and the first thing he says is, "This is no Barbary rover," muttered Joe fearsomely. "Look how old it seems. Almost ready to fall to pieces. Why, 'tis fairly rotten." Well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not necessarily from Barbary, but whatever. There was no one on deck, no one in the long sweep with which the craft was steered. We stole to the hold and looked down the stair. Then and there, if ever men were on the verge of insanity, it were we. Okay, that's well worded. For there were rowers there, it is true. They sat upon the rowers' benches that drove the creaking oars through the sullen waters. And they that rowed were skeletons. Shrieking, we plunged across the deck to fling ourselves into the sea, but at the rail I tripped upon something and fell headlong. As I lay, I saw a thing which vanquished my fear of the horrors below in an instant. The thing in which I had tripped was a human body, and in the dim grey light that was beginning to steal across the eastern waves, I saw a dagger hilt standing up between the shoulders. Joe was at the rail, urging me to haste, and together we slid down the chain and cut the painter. Okay, so you've got a Barbary boat coming in, being rowed by skeletons. Okay, that's pretty horrifying. And it's got a body on it with a dagger sticking out of the shoulder blades. This is escalating quickly. So they stand off this thing. They go, okay, well, let's get some distance here. But they decide they are going to follow this thing because they're interested in where it's going. And they look and they see that there's a whole throng of people at the wharf and that the ship is heading straight to the shore beside the wharf. Now, this is the comment, and I'm going to throw this in right now. This is the comment that makes me think the narrator is a young lad of 10 to 13. Now, here, I'm going to read this, okay? Okay, so it's early in the morning. Why are all these people standing at the shore? Here's why. They had missed this, no doubt, and now stood there. And now they stood, there in the early dawn, struck dumb by the apparition which had come out of the night and the grim ocean. They had missed us, no doubt. Well, hold on. If you're a young man, that's a young adult, is the village going to miss you and be out there first thing? Like, we're talking early morning, looking for you? No, they're not. And this is what makes me think this is obviously somebody younger. And that's why I would say 10 to 13 is kind of the range. Because at 10 to 13, yeah, I remember being 10 to 13 years old. I was dumb enough to row a rowboat out into the fog if somebody dared me to. Yeah, would I do that now? I hope not. But either way, that's where I gauge that from. It's from my own personal experience as well as that comment. Now, there's other language we'll get into when we talk more about the archaic language. But that's the big one for me. Okay, anyways. Back to the actual story. The galley approaches the shore, and then this is where something almost Lovecraftian hits. There's a massive crash and a reverberation. Now, when I read this, I think almost earthquake with a cracking sound. And then the ship dissolves. It's gone. And everybody who's on the shore watching this ship, it's waiting for this ship to hit the shore, suddenly see it disappear. This bubbling ocean where it was, but that's it. There's nothing. So Joe and this nameless narrator have also seen this happen. And they're like, oh, what is it? There's not even driftwood, but there is something floating towards the shore. All right. Here's where we get to the big conclusion. All right. Big conclusion time here. Okay. There we go. I'm just going to read it. Okay. We made the landing amid the hum of excited conversation that stopped suddenly. Moll Farrell stood before her hut. And this is a word that I'm struggling with. I've read this now many times. I'm thinking it's limbed. Limned, gauntly against the ghostly dawn, her lean hand pointing seaward, and across the sighing wet sands, borne by the grey tide, something came floating, something that the waves dropped at Moll Farrell's feet. Ooh, right at her feet, you say. Interesting. And there, looking up at us as we crowded around, a pair of unseeing eyes set in still white face. John Colrec had come home. Still and grim he lay, rocked by the tide, and as he lurched sideways, all saw a dagger hilt that stood from his back. The dagger all of us had seen 1,000 times at the belt of Lyle Canule. I killed him, came Lyle Canule's shriek, as he writhed and grovelled before our gaze. At sea on a still night in a drunken brawl, I slew him and hurled him overboard. And from the far seas he has followed me. His voice sank to a hideous whisper. Because of the curse, the sea would not keep his body. Ooh, that's creepy. As the wretch sank back, trembling, the shadow of the gallows already in his eyes. Aye, strong, deep, and exultant was Moll Farrell's voice. From the hell of lost craft, Satan sent a ship of bygone ages, a ship red with gore and stained with the memory of horrid crimes. None other would bear such a vile carcass. The sea has taken vengeance and has given me mine. See now how I spit upon the face of John Colrec. And with a ghastly laugh she pitched forward, the blood starting at her lips, and the sun came up across the restless sea. Ooh, ooh, oh, that, oh. Now, that could be taken in a couple ways as to exactly what happened to Moll at the end of this story. Now, we'll get into my interpretation of exactly what happened to this when we get into more of the archaic language. But for now, because I see from the little tickety-tickety clock going on the actual recorder here, I'm 35 minutes in. I need a nature break. Okay, so we're back. So let's start talking through some of the themes that really jump out in this story. I think the obvious theme, and this is the one that really screams through the subtext in the whole story, is the continuous reference here where we've got cronies and frightened town people not taking action when they should. It really speaks to a groupthink and how a loud single person amongst what otherwise would be called, I guess, a timid crowd can actually materially sway the people think. I mean, if this person is bad, it really makes a bad scenario. And it really gets to the point of, well, if this person's so bad and you all know they're bad, why don't you do something about it? It's funny, at the end of this one, you saw Lylip knowing that he's going to the gallows for what he did. So clearly there's some legal ramifications for what he did. He specifically killed John and admitted that he did it. But throughout the earlier parts of the story, they talked about whenever a man's beaten, nobody took action about it. So when John was out there beating somebody or doing something that was illegal or wrong, he could get away with it, but Lylip couldn't. It's interesting that really Lylip, being a crony of John, granted him some sort of, we'll call it pseudo-authority, but that authority was never strong enough. It's actually John, the bully, the loud one, that really was the one that created this sense of authority that allowed them to get away with what they could. He just didn't have it. And it juxtaposes the whole bully leader versus the whole cravenous hanger-on. Really, there's a big difference in the power dynamic there. And it's interesting. You see that time and time again when you're watching Disney films and the bad guy always has a flunky. You're reading a comic book and the bad guy has a bootlicker. It's invariably something there. And it's funny because that's something that's 100 years ago obviously fitting in this story. But here we are today with it fitting all the way along the way. Interesting theme. Another interesting theme that came out of this one is really the theme of this weaker, this seemingly weaker individual literally having the power that was there all along that was necessary to take out this bully, this John, this super powerful person within this city. It juxtaposes the whole idea of this it doesn't need to be something that's equally as loud that takes it down. It just needs to be something that's different. And really, the power of this seemingly weak old witch to come back and correct this at the end of the day, you could look at as being almost Howard's way of drawing a morality play into this. This is a Robert E. Howard story. Robert E. Howard uses anti-heroes and unconventional things that aren't necessarily what you think of as your golden age chivalrous knight to solve a problem. I think this actually is Howard's morality coming into this, saying, well, no, obviously these two bad guys, the antagonists, were wrong. So let's put the protagonist in here and juxtapose them. It's interesting that you've got this seemingly weak individual that at the end of the day really was just not utilizing the level of power they had to create the fear and awe that the bully was. The loud bully was actually weaker than the quiet witch. It's fascinating how that comes into play there and how that really just ends the whole thing. Another thing that really comes into play here is really how powerful Moll was. If you think about this, she cast a curse. Now bear in mind, she lived a poor lifestyle. She barely eked by collecting shellfish and driftwood. I still don't know how you'd make money off of driftwood. I'm just not picturing it. But accepted that as just what she would do in her life, and she was content enough to do that without using or abusing her power to get anything more. But at the end of the day, she was able to make snow stay on the nearby hills all summer long. She had that Eldritch level of power where she was able to say, no, that's just it. She had the power. If you think about this and you read the subtext, she had the authority to force Satan to send a boatload of his own skeletons, I guess we'll call them that, just to pick up this body and dump it out of the ocean. That was her claim there. If you think about this, this is a very powerful idea of a demon that you've just invoked and forced to do something just because you cast a curse. And that is something. Now, it actually speaks to another sub-theme that could come in later, but I think we'll get to that when we talk more, or at least we'll allude to it when we talk more about the specific archaic language. Now, what in this story really spoke to me? Like, what was it that really jumped out to me? Well, it's interesting that I think it was the absolute power when Moll had her blow up. And deservedly so. What happened to her was horrible. What happened to her niece was horrible. But that sudden moment where you had John and Lilip basically running through the town, running rickshaw, for lack of a better word. They could do whatever they want. They could do no wrong. They were immune to any sort of authority. And it's when Moll erupted with that curse that we read here in this video, in this podcast, that suddenly it was like almost like throwing off the shell of weakness and suddenly asserting, no, you two idiots listen to me. I'm the one with the authority here. You're both going to die. And this is specifically how it's going to happen because you wronged me. And it wasn't done in such a way that it was abusing them. It was done in such a way that it was almost judgment. It was this authority figure that could have the ability to invoke something way beyond what the townfolk and the villagers of Pharaoh Town are used to, or Faring Town are used to, in order to solve this problem. And that really was just a moment where suddenly you realize where the real power source in the story was. That spoke to me. It really did. Like when that suddenly just it's like, I don't know. It's like Odysseus throwing off the cloak and pulling out his bow and arrow and suddenly killing all of the suitors. It's like, where did that come from? It's a material moment and it jumps. Now, that really was one where I had to stop and put the book down and just go, oh, what just happened there? And really come back to it. Emotionally, though, I think the one that got the biggest reaction from me in this story was what you'd call the crash and the reverberation that occurred when the galley ghost ship, let's call it that, just suddenly dissolved and ceased to be. In my mind, I picture that being like a reverberation, almost like an explosion going outward. And that, when I read it, was one where it was just a full body shudder sort of moment, just in the descriptive language he used. And literally, goosebumps jumping off of my arm while I was reading that point in the story. It was one of those moments that's written so well and so powerfully by Robert E. Howard that it emotionally just draws it out of you. There's only one other thing that I've read by Robert E. Howard that shook me that much, and that might be the topic of another video we do here in a subsequent episode of the Tennessee Fast Library podcast. Okay, let's get into the next section here, which is the archaic language. There's a bunch of archaic language that jumped out of this one, and it really warranted diving into. Now, we might not do this archaic language thing anymore on these podcasts, but in this particular one, I wanted to include it. And I referenced this back at the beginning of the video. The story's 100 years old. 97 exact years old, I think. And the language in here is such that we need to dive into it a bit. And it's interesting because the first pieces of this are actually the ones that lead to answering a lot of the questions for me about this nameless narrator, this boy that lives in the village. I can't say that it's really the language and the tone and the way that the narrator speaks that makes you think, okay, this is a young child. But it's more so in the terminology that's used around them. The first one was something we read in the intro chapter, which is the tussle-haired lad. Now, basically, lad, young man, okay. Now, young man as a lad could mean a lot of things. Tousled-haired, however, that's the one where I thought, okay, there might be something to this. Maybe this is a term that I just don't know. So I did some digging on it. Couldn't really find much. Tousled-haired derives from the term tussled, which means to make untidy or messy. There's no definition of the age of a person in lad, though, and nothing really came up. But I'll tell you something that did come up that was interesting, which is jumped in Googling when I looked up tousled-haired lad. Because If you're out there wandering around the streets nowadays, or if you have a teenage child, and you look at the typical mop of hair that sits on top of their head, that's tussle-haired right there and then. And it's interesting because I'm going to read this quote here. "This look can be achieved through a haircut with longer layers and styling products like sea salt spray or clay, or by using a diffuser or damp hair to enhance texture." It's interesting that it referenced sea salt spray or in your hair, and this story takes place by the sea. I'm thinking maybe there's something more to this tussle than the sea thing that we're getting here. Okay, when the nameless narrator and Joe were sitting in the boat and they were talking about how they were going to dare one another, effectively trying to coax one another into agreeing to row out into the bay during the fog, he referred to himself as, "We were a couple of harum-scarum lads." Now, Harum-Scarum is a rock band. It's a Canadian rock band. But this is well before the time of Howard. So what the heck? So again, this word lad comes up. Again, no real sense of age. But Harum-Scarum definitely means sort of a wild or reckless in nature, which would suggest something or somebody that's sort of a younger individual. And this is where I lean more towards that younger point. And it was then when we go back to that quote that I read earlier, when we were walking through the story, where I explained, well, why would these people have noticed they're missing or missed them and gone looking for them all night? They must have been younger individuals enough to actually warrant, oh, we need to go looking all night to find them. Now, juxtapose that against the fact that they clearly were looking all night for Moll's niece. Well, she must have been older, or at least I would hope she was older as far as the context of this story goes. But anyways, I'm going to leave that at that. Now, niece was put to shame. We read this when we went through this story. And I gave you my analogy as to, well, here's what I think happened here. And I said, this is why I think this is what happened. But let's start drilling down into the narrative here, because really, was this something where she was drowned by John? Did she drown herself? Was there some act here that would suggest that she was forcibly raped? And then she killed herself, because that's where this reference of put to shame was. And this is the point where I'm like, well, I don't know. And really, I have to come back to one line within this that kind of answered this for me. And I had to drill down on this one and really make a point of this. And it's where Howard is introducing the niece herself. And the reference he makes when he's talking about her, he says, "The girl was a pretty, foolish little thing, vain and easily befooled, else she had never yielded to the shark-like blandishments of John Kurlak." Now, there's key terms in here that actually answered it for me. So I did, because I can tell you, when you Google put to shame, a bajillion things come up. Nothing really comes out clearly. And it's the foolish little thing, vain and easily befooled, else she had never yielded. That was really the point where I jumped back and I said, okay, this is what makes me think that she did, in fact, willingly sleep with this John Kurlak person, or yeah, I think I got the name right. And this is probably what happened. Now, do I think that John then killed her? I don't know. The put to shame thing, though, is the one that we're really diving into here. I suspect that John did not kill her or drown her, that she drowned herself. And that as a result, he was legitimately surprised when he found that she had been drowned. But I think maybe he suspected something like that would happen. Now, the last piece here, archaic language. And this is in the last sentence here. Okay. Now, this is where, when I got to the end of the story, I said, ooh, now that's got layers and that could mean something. Here's where we're at here. You remember the point where Moll had made her little speech and had spat, or was about to spit upon, or did spit upon the body of John. And at that point in time, the narrator says she pitched forward, blood starting to her lips. Now, I looked up pitched forward. That's just falling forward. Blood starting to her lips. I wondered if that was a term. It's apparently not a term. Now, it is a term that is used sparingly with regards to bleeding from the mouth, or something coming out, literally blood coming out of your mouth or around your mouth. So here's where, when I was saying that could actually be a really dark ending, and it could actually lead into a little bit more context with regards to Moll and the power that she wielded here. She didn't really wield any power or abused it when she was living poor in the city or in the village. The townsfolk suspected she was a witch, but they didn't really see her doing anything egregious or outlandish. So I guess that's why it was just permitted to continue to exist or continue to carry on. So she casts a massive curse that leads to not only 2 people dying, snow staying on a hill for the entire time, fog coming in and befogging the entire town for a day, a ghost ship coming up full of skeletons to deliver a body from across the world. That's powerful stuff. Really powerful stuff. Just so that she could spit upon him. Did she in fact spit upon him, paying the final price for the strength of the curse that she threw, and died, collapsing on the corpse now that she had been given hers? She pitched forward, and blood started to her lips. I am choosing, my choice, to infer with this that she did in fact pitch forward, drop dead on the corpse of John, knowing that she had received, well, just, I guess, her comeuppance, her vengeance, as John got his comeuppance. So, yeah, really an interesting one there, and quite a fun one to find. Now, I guess we'll get into the last part here, which is, what else can you read that comes out of this? One of the things I mentioned is this story takes place in Faringtown. It is Faringtown, right? Yeah, Faringtown. And I mentioned that this story repeats, this village pops up a couple times just in this collection of the horror stories of Robert E. Howard. I do believe that Howard was trying to create in Faringtown another Appalachian village like you saw coming out of H.P. Lovecraft. And H.P. Lovecraft would pick villages and things that he had created in his mind of, here's where I'm putting this particular horror story. And he would repeat these or reference them, and repeat authors and reference them back and forth. Howard did this as well. There are various tomes that are referenced by Howard characters that transcend individual stories and pop up in other stories. I think Faringtown, as it's set in this story, is really a tone-setting piece and a village-creating piece to give the readers a common sense of another story that could come afterwards. There is another story in here. The poem, I think, is called A Legend of Faringtown, and the story is called Out of the Deep, which takes place in Faringtown. Now, that one, I read it quite some time ago. That one really does continue the motifs, the dark themes, the fog, the finger-like coastline, the hills. All the geography that you saw in this story continues in that. I would suggest if you want to read more Faringtown, Out of the Deep would probably be your next one you want to jump into. I can't remember, though, if this particular name was Young Lad, a tousled-haired lad, that's the narrator, returns as a narrator in that or not. If I do remember correctly, it is narrated. That might be something to dive into at a later date. It's interesting because this one really is a story wherein, okay, as I mentioned earlier, it's 2 bullies getting their comeuppance because they crossed the line. They did something wrong. And justly so. But it's really a story also of a curse and the power of that curse coming from somebody that really just threw off the coil of weakness when they cast it. And it really sets the tone of, ooh. And I was trying to think, what's another curse story that you... And it's funny, I really... Top of my head, nothing else jumped out like this. Now, I'm sure there are others. I'm sure this is a common theme. Initially, I was thinking something like Edgar Allan Poe, The Fall of the House of Usher. But again, that's not really so much of a curse as it is so many other things. And what's also interesting is that led me to actually look more into that story. I actually pulled out my collected Poe work and was poking around that one earlier this week. It's an interesting one, but I don't think it's directly related. I would say if you do want to dive more into something that was covered here, there's lots of ghost ship stories. Because don't forget, this one does have a ghost ship that comes rowing back in. You can find tons of those. They're a lot of fun to read. It's one of the things that I actually read regularly. I have a couple books up in the library about ghost ships. But really, the only thing that I could say going forward in this is go into that Out of the Deep story, which is another story of Faringtown that Howard wrote. Yeah, that's really it. Did I like this story? That's an interesting question. I did like this story. I like this story a lot. And in fact, I think that's sort of self-evident because I chose this as the first story we're covering in the Tennessee Fats Library podcast series. This is a cool story. It's got a lot of neat layers to it. And although it seems somewhat simplistic, there are so many themes and so many archetypes that jump out of this. You're like, ooh, I enjoyed a lot of this one. Well, there you go. Well, everybody, that's the end of the Tennessee's Vats Library podcast #1, where we have covered Robert E. Howard's Sea Curse. I hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll see you in the next one.